A little while back, I made a video talking about the 4 different categories into which TfL divides its underground stations. These are local, metro, destination, and gateway. I went into more detail about what all that means in that video, but simple version, it classifies the stations based on level of service, number of passengers, type of passengers, how many staff are needed, and so forth. But there's an unofficial 5th category. Not applicable. Stations that don't fall into any of those categories. Stations that are, in essence, not really underground stations. I thought it might be interesting to look through those stations and see what we can find out. Not gonna lie, we're going to get pretty nerdy around here, even by the standards of this channel. In alphabetical order, the stations are Barking, Heathrow Terminal 5, Kensington Olympia, Richmond, Upminster, Willesden Junction, and Wimbledon. That's a diverse bunch. What they have in common is that they're not operated by London Underground, but beyond that, not much else. Barking is managed by C2C, the company currently in charge of the Essex Thameside service, which runs from Fenchurch Street to Tilbury, Southend, Shoeburyness, and other Essex destinations. It's owned by Network Rail. On the Underground, it's served by the District line, but it's also on the Overground's Gospel Oak to Barking Riverside line, also known as the Goblin. And there are the C2C services, of course. Upminster has a similar deal going on, managed by C2C, owned by Network Rail, served by C2C, the Overground, and the District, which terminates there. In this case, the Overground line is the Little Romford to Upminster line. I should probably stop referring to it as the Little Romford to Upminster line. It's very patronising. Oh well. Another district terminus is Richmond. This is again owned by Network Rail, but it's managed by South Western Railway. District trains come in at the side there, next to the Overground's North London line. There's a similar situation with Wimbledon. South Western Railway manages it, Network Rail owns it, the district terminates here. The station is also served by the Thameslink line to Sutton, and it's the only place on the network where the trams meet the Underground. Well, unless you count the out-of-station interchange between South Wimbledon and Morden Road, which I don't. Kensington Olympia is yet another district line station and yet another terminus. It's only served on the Underground by a shuttle from Earl's Court, which runs at weekends, early mornings, late evenings, and when there's an exhibition on at the adjacent exhibition centre. This means that it sees the fewest overall Underground services of any station on the tube network. It has a far more frequent service from the Overground, who manage the station, which sits on the West London line. It's also served by Southern, and yes, Network Rail are the owners. Willesden Junction is also managed by the Overground and owned by Network Rail. This one is served by the Bakerloo line and by 2 of the Overground's lines, the North London and the Watford DC routes. So it makes a lot of sense that it should be considered an Overground station first and foremost. What's odd is that none of the other stations on this route are classed as Overground stations. Not even Harrow and Willesden, the bulk of which is taken up by National Rail services. All are managed by the Underground. Heathrow Terminal 5 is the real odd one out. It's owned by Heathrow Airport Holdings and managed by Heathrow Express. It's served by the aforementioned Heathrow Express, but also the Elizabeth line. The Underground line here is the Piccadilly line. There are 2 other Heathrow stations on the Piccadilly line, Terminals 2 and 3 and Terminal 4. And Hatton Cross if you want to be pedantic. But those are all conventional Underground stations. Terminal 5 was the last of the Heathrow terminals to be built, and the station was fully integrated into the terminal from the very start. Hence the fact that it's the only one on this list not to officially be a railway station. All of the other stations are, foremost, National Rail stations that happen to have Underground lines running into them. Now the obvious question that arises is, what about stations like Euston and Waterloo? Big termini, primarily National Rail, served by the Underground. Well, the Underground stations in those cases are technically separate from the Mainline stations. The Underground stations were later additions. In fact, in many cases, they were built entirely separate from the Mainline stations that they served. Hence, for instance, the abandoned Underground station building at Euston, and the entrance to Liverpool Street that's over the road from the main station. Apart from Heathrow and Willesden Junction, all the stations are District Line. The District Line began as the Metropolitan District Railway, and if you're a regular viewer, you'll know that the District was not a railway company that liked to spend money if they could help it. They liked to negotiate the rights to use other people's lines and stations wherever practical, because it was cheaper than building their own. Wimbledon and Richmond stations were built by the London and South Western Railway. Kensington Olympia was built by the West London Railway. And Upminster and Barking were London, Tilbury and Southend. Hence, all of these are not underground stations, the district just sort of sneaked in there. Willesden Junction is kind of complicated, so I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me. It was first built by the London and North Western Railway on their West Coast main line. In 1869, the North London Railway built their own station, which is now the North London Line platforms of the Overground. The Bakerloo/Watford DC bit was opened in 1910, built by the LNWR, but intended from the start to be jointly operated with the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway, or Bakerloo Line to you and me. In 1962, the West Coast Main Line station was closed, leaving what we have today. So again, the tube was a latecomer in what was somebody else's station. So that's the pattern. If it's primarily National Rail, and the Underground uses the National Rail station, it's usually not considered an Underground station. Now, you could point out exceptions to this rule. There's the aforementioned Harrow and Wealdstone. There's Whitechapel, originally built for the East London Line, which is now the Overground. In those cases, I don't know. I honestly have no idea, and it was a fool's errand to try to make sense of London's rail network. Well, I hope you enjoyed this disowned tale from the tube. If you did, please do leave a like to inform YouTube, and consider subscribing if you have not done so already. I would, as always, like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the running rights to my pre-existing station. And I'll see you all again very soon, I hope, for another tale from the tube.